Welcome to my channel. Over the past 8 months, I have been presenting content on Codex Oera Linda, the English language translation by Jan Ottema, the world's foremost living authority on all things Oera Linda, and myself, which he has been working on for over a decade, and we as a team have been refining and revising since 2021. My videos are designed to promote Codex Oera Linda to a broader audience, as well as to examine the manuscript and share insights about its language and narrative, as well as the ancient high culture described in its 210 handwritten pages. This fascinating work involves research as well as introspection, and in some cases, downright detective work. For instance, Jan Ottema recently went digging in the archives of the town of Leeuwarden, an important municipality in conjunction with Codex Oera Linda, both in story and as part of its history since coming to light through publication of the first translation in 1872 by Dr. Jan Ottema. As I talked about in my video Lost in Translation, Dr. Ottema was a well-respected, very learned man. He was a member of the steering committee of the Frisian Society for the Study of History and Language, who authored books and articles on topics ranging from the Frisian language to classical languages to ancient history and theology. However, his vehement conviction that the Oera Linda manuscript represented the oldest existing European historical document and a unique source for the Frisian language in its purest form quickly brought on attacks by a cadre of detractors, including physician Dr. Jan Winkler, an expert in onomastics, the study of proper names, and himself an author of several books, including a broad analysis of Low German dialects, including Flemish, Dutch, Frisian, and Saxon. Winkler was the first person entrusted with the task of preparing a report on the manuscript for the Frisian Society, and he quickly began to suspect that it was, in his own words, not kosher. Winkler's account of the affair portrays Ottema as excitable and gullible, and Winkler, a strongly religious Christian, was aghast at Ottema's willingness not only to accept the blasphemous Oera Linda as authentic, but to go so far as to discuss it with him in church, in the presence of other churchgoers no less. Long after the death of Dr. Ottema, Winkler made sure to immediately label him a, quote, prematurely aged, feeble, and nervous man in his recounting of the meeting at which Winkler himself had reported that the Oera Linda manuscript was indeed a fake and not worthy of any further study or consideration. Yet Ottema was left unconvinced by Winkler's precipitous rejection and decided to carry on with analysis of the material. Certainly, Ottema, as can be said of anyone, had his flaws and was not exempted from human emotion, bias, or proneness to error. For instance, there are some drastic mistranslations in his work on the Oera Linda manuscript, alongside more subtle gaps and misunderstandings. One of the most important, as it sets the tone for further apprehension of the attitude of the Freya people toward outsiders, was his translation of the word ot in the primal history section, which he took to mean hate, based on the Latin root odi, as in odious or odium, defined as hate coupled with disgust. Perhaps if he had taken more time, had access to better sources, or possibly been able to let go of preconceived notions about the language, or more significantly the people and culture of ancient Frisia, he would have run across the Old Saxon word ot, an abstract reference to a power that brings luck, or pondered the German word Kleinod, referring to a physical good luck charm or a trinket imbued by a group or individual with meaning. And according to Dr. Gerhard Köppler, Professor Emeritus, University of Innsbruck, There are Old Saxon words built around the suggested root ot, like anbiotan, to deliver a message or offer, fodian, to feed or nourish, affodian, to bear or deliver a child, to raise and nourish, not to mention Freya's words like got, G-O-D, and modr, M-O-D-E-R. All these terms relate strongly to the solution ultimately chosen by Jan Ott and me, namely, to keep the original word, od, ot, as an abstraction for the creative and nourishing power of the Freya's notion of God, Vralda, the uncreated eldest of the old. These od words do not relate to the Latin root odi, hatred and disgust, which Ottema chose. Indeed, the word odi might even be viewed as the precise opposite of ot, which is a loving force of creation, as evidenced by the section in question. From the Primal History section. After the 12th coming of the Yule day, Earth bore 3 girls. Lyda was of glowing hot, Finda of hot, and Freya of warm substance. Upon their birth, Vralda fed each of them with his breath, so that mankind should be bound to him. Once they matured, they soon found delight and satisfaction in their dreams. Vralda's Ot entered into them, and so each bore 12 sons and 12 daughters, twins each Yuletide. Of these, all mankind has come. In fact, his misunderstanding of the word ought, whatever the cause, is not the only significant error made by Ottema in this brief but key section of the manuscript, and I could cite further examples in other places. Whatever his shortcomings, however, there is a malicious rumor about Dr. Ottema's life and death that is completely undeserved, and which must be set straight out of respect for a man who dedicated himself to discovering and teaching all he could about the origins of his people, and stood in the courage of his own convictions. Thanks to solid detective work on the part of Jan Ott, we can now say definitively, to put it in modern parlance, Ottema did not kill himself. And by the way, did you know he killed himself in shame when he realized how he had been tricked? This and similar refrains almost invariably accompany supposed refutations of the Oera Linda manuscript's authenticity. Like the icing on the cake or the cherry on top of the hackneyed assertions parroted as proof, this final defamation of Jan Ottema is the coup de grace delivered to all his reasoned and researched arguments over the final years of his life. I won't argue the substance of these matters here, but I will call out the rumor-mongering by academics. For instance, Dr. Goffe Jensma, whose one well-known treatise, The Masked God, could be seen as a rehashing of the conspiracy theory propounded in the early 20th century by the previously mentioned Dr. Winkler. He seems to have made a career out of defaming any and all who would take the Oera Linda manuscript seriously, sullying the reputations of several men specifically, including Dr. Ottema. So if Ottema didn't commit suicide, what is the truth of the matter? Was Ottema perhaps murdered for his audacious and ill-advised crusade to prove the authenticity of the Oera Linda manuscript and the alternative history it represents in the face of opposition from those with the most to lose? The power elite of church, government, and the recently installed Royal House of Orange? While the answer is not quite as exciting as all that, the simple document dug up in Leeuwarden, Jan Ottema's death certificate from the year 1879, is no less earth-shattering for those who would casually besmirch the name of a dead man. Paraphrasing from The Masked God, Ottema's last years were not cheerful. His life ended in 1879 in a lonely twilight. Looking around, he saw how his allies had quietly and ashamedly slunk away. Little by little, He had destroyed his good name as a classicist, sacrificed to the Oera Linda Book. Now that he had been proven wrong, the consequences became painfully apparent. Not only his translation of the Oera Linda Book, but his entire body of work was now regarded by the learned world as a faux pas. According to some, Ottema finally realized, after all, that he had erred, and that he had lost his honor as a classicist. With this truth, he was unwilling to live. He hung himself. Notice the weaselly phrase, according to some. This equivocation frees the author of blame for poisoning the well and claiming an easily disproven story as support for his screed. Later, however, in the introduction to his own 2006 translation of the Oera Linda manuscript, Professor Jensma moved on from his initial fence-sitting and presented the suicide story as fact on page 50. When Ottema, abandoned by everyone, finally realized in 1879 that he had been wrong and that he had taken for old what was new, he decided there was no point in continuing to live and hanged himself. Such baseless insinuation, however, is now rendered void because, as documented by this death certificate, photographed in the archive of Leeuwarden, Dr. Jan Ottema died at the age of 74 on the 19th of March, 1879 at 7:30 a.m., not from hanging or from any other form of suicide, but from pneumonia. To be accurate, this is not a death certificate, but the record of the proceedings of the official declaration of death with witnesses. Claiming that shame and despair caused Dr. Ottema to take his own life to lend emotional credence to your theories that the Oera Linda manuscript is a fake and that Ottema would agree with you if he were still alive, can be viewed at best as the spreading of hearsay. And given that the cause of death is clearly stated in the certificate, which is available to anyone in the archive, some might say it borders on deliberate deception. In truth, there is no evidence that Dr. Ottema ever repented of his views about Codex Oera Linda. Thus, we must accept as still valid Ottema's assertions, summarized aptly in this quote published shortly before his death in the second edition of his Geschiedskundige Aantekeningen en Ophelderingen, which leaves no doubt about his steadfast conclusions. I quote, "A 7-year continuous study of the book and everything written about it has consistently reaffirmed my conviction." Join me soon for more videos about Codex Oera Linda, its language and history, and the resources available to anyone interested in learning more about this fascinating document.